Hey guys, it's Austin here with Out Jeeping, and in today's video I'm going to be showing you guys how to do a quick, cheap, and easy steering upgrade on the front end of your Jeep Cherokee. Now the upgrade that we're going to be doing today is a Grand Cherokee XJ V8 tie rod swap. So let's get started. Alright, so let's first take a look at the steering that's already on this Jeep. This Jeep is a 99 Cherokee with a solid axle Dana 30 high pinion axle up front here. Alright, so up here we have our steering linkage, and this is also referred to just as the Y steering setup, and that's because it kind of looks like a Y. We got a tie rod that pretty much sits level, and then we got a drag link going up to the pitman arm, which kind of makes that a little bit of a Y setup as the tie rod attaches right here into the drag link. So with this steering setup, we have a total of 4 tie rod ends. We got one up by the pitman arm, one here in the middle of the drag link, one on the end on the knuckle on the passenger side, and then one all the way over to the driver's side knuckle. Now this steering setup, it's probably fine for having a stock Jeep, but even having a stock Jeep, if it's a little bit older, things get rusty and it's hard to adjust things. So one of the biggest problems with the steering setup with adjusting it is that this tie rod right here, it's actually threaded on the inside on both ends, so that way if you want to adjust your toe, all you have to do is turn this tie rod either one way or the other, and it's going to tow in your tires in and out. And what happens over time is that the threads on the tie rod ends, they kind of get rusted into the tie rod, and it actually, it's really hard to turn. Sometimes you have to take a pipe wrench just to be able to break them free and turn it. I've had times where I did that on my old Jeep before I upgraded the steering to crossover steering. I used a pipe wrench and actually bent the tie rod just, with my foot trying to turn this thing. So with our solution today, we are going to fix that with a different tie rod setup. All the other components that we're going to be replacing, they're pretty much going to be the same, but we're going to have a much beefier tie rod, and it's going to be a lot easier to adjust. Alright, so here's what we're going to be replacing the steering with today. I'm going to be doing a complete steering overhaul and replacing all the components, as most of them are probably all worn out. I did replace the tie rod end about a few months ago, but it was cheap anyway, so I'm just going to replace everything. So to start off, I got everything here for just about under 150 bucks, so it's really not expensive. I got most of the parts here off of Rock Auto, which definitely saved a lot of money. And then I got this steering stabilizer right here because I thought I'd replace that as well since I'm doing everything. I went ahead and just got the Rough Country one because it's only 35 bucks, and I haven't tried out their N3 series shocks, so we'll see how long that's going to last. I haven't had any luck with the N2s in the past because a lot of the seals like to blow out. But anyway, with these components right here, everything is pretty much exactly the same as you would find on a stock Cherokee, except for the tie rod end over here and just having another collar. So basically we have our same exact drag link that's right here. We have our tie rod end that goes up to our pitman arm, and we got our adjustment collar that's right here. So instead of running that factory style Cherokee flimsy tie rod, we're going to be upgrading to this Grand Cherokee XJ V8 tie rod. So this is going to be found on any XJ that has a 5.9 or 5.2 V8 engine. And basically this is all cast steel, so this is going to be a lot stronger than the other setup that we have on the Cherokee. And also it's going to have more strength because instead of using 11/16 threaded ends over here, we're moving up to 22 millimeter, which is going to be exactly the same as what you would find over here on the pitman arm. So as far as this tie rod end over here, it's going to be exactly the same as what you're going to find on the pitman arm end. It's going to be an M22 reverse thread. So basically these two parts right here are exactly the same, as well as the adjustment collar over here. And this is going to provide a lot stronger connection compared to the old 11/16 thread that you're going to find on the factory tie rod end. So now to adjust our toe, instead of having to take the entire tie rod and move it back and forth to adjust the tires in and out, all we have to do is adjust this collar over here, which is going to be located on the driver's side. And all we have to do is just basically turn it the same way we would the tie rod to be able to adjust our toe. And same thing over here, we got another adjustment collar, which is basically the factory setup on all Jeeps, and basically you turn this and it's going to adjust your steering wheel so that way it's straight along with the wheels. Now there are other alternatives out there that you can actually beef up the steering on a Cherokee. One of those options is that Rough Country actually offers a bigger tie rod, and it just uses the same design of having the factory tie rod end style and just having a thicker tie rod. The downside to that is you don't get the strength of having these 22mm threads. You still have those 11/16 threads, which can be a weak point if you do hit your steering on a rock or something like that. And there's also 1-ton steering options you can upgrade as well. There's some that have the greasable ball joint style tie rod ends, and there's others that have crossover steering with Heim joints. I've ran that on my silver Jeep in the past, and I'm not actually a big fan of it anymore, just because I daily drove that Jeep for a while, and those Heim joint ends actually, you know, being exposed to the elements, they start to corrode and everything like that, and they start squeaking and, you know, have some slop in them. And the downside to 1-ton steering is that it's a lot more expensive. You're going to be spending like $250 to $300, and it keeps going up. This over here, it's only $150, and it keeps a factory style, easy to adjust steering, so why not upgrade to this? So with all that being said, I'm going to post a link in the description below on all these parts so you guys can find them. Most of these parts are just all AC Delco. I've had good luck with them in the past. And these collars over here, I forget what makes them, but I'll link it below. They're only like $3.50 each, so they're relatively cheap off Rock Auto. So we're going to start taking apart the Jeep and getting that old steering off. But while we have everything up here, I'm going to start installing the grease zerks and all of the tie rod ends, so that way we can get that out of the way. Alright, so for installing the grease zerks on these new tie rod ends, it's pretty straightforward. We just got our grease zerk right here. We're going to start threading that in by hand, so that way we don't cross thread it. And then we're going to either take a 5/16 or 8mm socket and just kind of thread it in. And we don't want to go too tight because we don't want to strip that out. We just want it to have a nice snug fit. Now we're going to repeat the process on the other 3 tie rod ends. Alright, so before we install our new steering linkages onto the Jeep, I'm going to make it a little bit easier and install our threaded collars on right now, so that way we won't have to fiddle with it while crawling underneath the Jeep. And before I put this collar onto these threads, I'm going to take some anti-seize and lubricate all these threads, so that way in the future, if we have to adjust our steering again, we can do it relatively easy since they won't be rusted up. So now we can take our clamps and slide them over the collar, and make sure you have your collar the right way, since one side is normal thread and the other side's reverse thread. Alright, so I got it threaded in on each side of the collar about 1.5 inches, and that'll give us a good starting place to get this aligned perfectly. We'll do the rest of it once it's on the Jeep. Now we can do the exact same process on the drag link. It's going to be the same thing with the tie rod end and our adjustment collar. Alright, so to start off with, I'm going to be chalking up the rear tires because we're actually going to be lifting up the front end and putting them on jack stands, so we don't want it to roll while it's up in the air. So I'm just going to take some blocks, chalk the tires. Alright, so what we're going to be doing for jacking up the front end of this Jeep is I'm going to take a jack up the axle, and then put some jack stands underneath the front axle, so that way the front tires will be off the ground, and I'm actually going to take off the front tires as well, so that way we get a little bit extra room on replacing those tie rod ends that are on the knuckles. Alright, so if you have a small enough jack stand, you can actually fit the head of the jack stand right underneath the lower control arm bushing, so that way it should support it and it shouldn't move at all. Alright, so with the wheels off and it jacked up like this, it gives us a lot more room to work in here. At the same time, it still keeps all the weight of the Jeep on the front axle, so that way this steering doesn't really move at all, and it's going to be exactly where it is as if it were on level ground. So since we're replacing all the components here today, I'm just going to take all of this steering off as one piece. We basically have 3 connections. We got tie rod ends on either knuckle. We got a tie rod end up here on the pitman arm. And then we also have a steering stabilizer that we're just going to unbolt from the drag link over here, and then unbolt it from the axle side once all the steering is out. Now before we start removing all this stuff, if you want to get your steering in the ballpark of kind of where it is now with the new steering, you can take a tape measure. You can measure from the tie rod end center bolt to center bolt on the opposite side, so that way you gotta get a rough estimate of where your toe is going to be. So I got my measurement already done, so I'm going to start off over here and start unbolting the steering stabilizer. So over here on this drag link, it's going to be a 3/4 nut. So I'm just going to zip that off with the impact. Now if you're reusing your steering stabilizer, you might want to be a little bit more gentle on hammering that out, but since I'm replacing mine, it doesn't matter if I mar up these threads. Alright, so I'm going to start with the hardest tie rod end to get off, and that's going to be up here on the pitman arm. Basically, up on top here, we have our nut, and it's locked in place with a cotter pin. As you can see, this one's all crusty, so hopefully it comes out nicely. Probably not though. So once we get that nut off, we're going to have to use a ratchet since we can't get a impact up here, obviously. And we'll get that off, and then we can use a pickle fork to put it in between the tie rod end and the pitman arm, so that way it breaks that bond and it should come free. So it looks like this one's breaking on me. That's fine. We got a new one to replace it. Then this nut up here is going to be a 3/4 as well. I'm just going to break it free with a breaker bar. So now we will take our pickle fork and sandwich it in between here. I'll also note that if you plan on reusing any tie rod end and you use a pickle fork, it will most likely damage the rubber boot that's on here. There we go. So now over here on the driver's side, it's going to be the same thing. We just got a cotter pin we're going to remove, and then we'll remove it, and then we can just use a hammer on this end since we have space to be able to get at it. Alright, now the very last thing we got to do is finish removing the steering stabilizer. So we just got an 18mm bolt right here. I got a wrench on the back, and I'm just going to impact this off. Alright, so I got the new and old tie rod side by side, so that way you guys can really tell the difference between the two. As you can see right here on the factory one, it's about a 7/8 inch diameter and it's a hollow tube. And over here, this is about a 1 inch diameter and it's solid cast steel. So this is definitely a lot stronger than the factory setup. Now one thing we are going to have to do before we install the steering stabilizer is put the steering stabilizer end in it. And all this hardware is included in the Rough Country kit. So basically we need to insert this end over here into this bushing that does not have the metal sleeve. And then we just need to tighten it up, and then it should be ready to install on the vehicle. So I'm going to install a little bit of grease on here so that way it goes in a little bit better in the rubber bushing. Then we just got to push this in. Doesn't matter which way, because as you know, this can go any direction you want. Then we'll take our bigger washer, lock washer, and then our nut. Now we can tighten this down. If it starts spinning, that's fine. We can finish tightening it when it's on the vehicle because this side should be locked in when we get it on there. And then this nut right here is going to be 11/16. Alright, so now we can actually start bolting on the new steering to the Jeep. I'm going to start over here on the passenger side knuckle, and I'm going to start bolting on the drag link first. And the end that goes over here is the end that does not have the adjustable collar on there. Alright, so we're just going to start off by taking this nut off, and during shipping they have this little plastic protector over here. We're just going to discard that because we won't need it anymore. And one thing I'll point out is if you're going the cheaper option with cheaper tie rod ends, there's two things you got to look for. One thing is that make sure it has a grease zerk on it so that way you can keep up with maintenance and make sure that there's grease in there all the time. Otherwise, if it doesn't have a grease boot and the grease in there goes bad or dries up, you're going to end up having just to replace the tie rod end once again instead of having that tie rod end last by putting more grease in there. Another thing is make sure you have a decent quality grease boot on here. As you can see, this one seals on top here and it's going to seal with the mating surface over here on the knuckle side. I'll show you in a little bit the tie rod ends that used to be on this Jeep. They just had a cheap little boot on here that didn't seal on this, and a bunch of dirt and crap just got in there, and it doesn't really keep in all that grease because it can easily just squirt out. But I'm going to take our tie rod end, feed it up in here. Then once we have threads, I'm going to start threading on our castle nut. or as engineers call it, just a slotted nut. And this is also a 3/4, so I'm just going to start tightening this up. So with tightening these up, you want to go relatively tight, but don't go too tight first, because we have to make sure that the slots in the nut right here line up with that hole that's in the stud of the tie rod end, so that way we can get our cotter pin in there and lock it down. So for me, I just got to turn mine a little bit, and once I see the holes line up, I'm going to take our new cotter pin, push it through the holes, and then take my pliers and just kind of wrap it around so that way this can't back out. Alright, so this should be good here on the passenger side. Now let's go hook up the pitman arm side. Alright, so it's going to be the same thing over here on the pitman arm. I'm just going to wipe off this old grease. You can kind of see with the boot styled on the old one, it just kind of left a mess of grease on all the ends. Fit it up into place and thread on the new slotted nut. Alright, so while we still have room in here, I'm going to go and install our new steering stabilizer. I'm going to start off on the axle end over here first. And then over here on the axle side, we also are going to reuse our 18mm bolt. So I just put some anti-seize on that because they do like to seize up in that bushing. And then we can thread our nut on the back. And then over here on the drag link end, we can install it on this upper hole. Then we got our lock washer and our nut. Now if we take a wrench on the back side, it's going to finish tightening up that other nut that's on there and tighten up this one as well. So we can tighten this one up all the way down. Alright, and that's tight on that end. Now we'll finish tightening up over here on the axle side. Alright, so now we can install our new tie rod. This end is going to be the end that does not have the collar on it. We're going to install it to the middle of the drag link at this other hole over here. So same thing, once again, just going to pull off this protective cap, slide it onto the back side of the drag link, and then feed our nut on. Then we got our new cotter pin. Alright, now the last thing we got to do is over here on the driver's side. Let's take the other end of our tie rod and bolt it in place. Alright, so that's pretty much it for installing all this stuff. Now we can go ahead and adjust our steering to where it was before, and then later on we'll have to take this in for alignment. Alright, so now we can adjust our toe and our steering wheel right now. And to do that, once again, we just got our two collars, one here and one here. The one on the tie rod is going to adjust our toe, and then the one on the drag link up here is going to adjust our steering wheel, so that way that's straight with the wheels. Now I'm just going to get this in the ballpark of where I had it before, so I got my measurement from the middle of the tie rod end bolt on either knuckle. So I'm just going to take a measurement, get it to close to where I was before, and then I'm going to lock this all down, and then later on when I get new tires for this thing, I'm going to get an alignment. But this right here just basically so that way you don't destroy your tires on the way to the alignment shop. So that the way these adjust, if you turn it down towards you, it's actually going to extend the rod, and if you go up away from you, it's going to shorten up the rod and draw it closer. So I'm going to get this roughly where it was before on my Jeep, and then we'll get ready to tighten these down. Alright, so now that we got the steering where we want it, we can go and tighten up the clamps that go around these collars over here. Just make sure they're kind of lined up so that the opening of the collar is where the opening of the clamp is, so that way it tightens up nice and securely. I went ahead and also put some anti-seize on these bolts, so that way in the future if I have to adjust anything, they should come off nicely. And one last thing, since we got grease zerks on here, now's a good time to take your grease gun and fill up the boots in here. Don't put too much in here that it squirts out, just put enough that the boot on here bulges out. Alright, so now we can put the tires and wheels back on, torque them down, and get this Jeep back on the ground and off the jack stands. Alright guys, that's going to do it for today's how-to video. Overall, everything went pretty smoothly, everything came out nicely with the old parts, and everything went in nicely with the new stuff. I do recommend getting a professional alignment after you do this. This is just to get it in a ballpark so that way you don't destroy your tires on the way to the alignment shop. So if you guys wanted to do this upgrade, it's a pretty cheap and easy one to do. You don't have to replace all the components like I did. You can just get a tie rod end and a new tie rod from a ZJ, and that'll run you about 60 bucks at the cheapest. You can get it off Rock Auto. As always, I'll post a link in the description below on all the parts that I used in this video, and I got a link down there for some out-jeeping decals that you guys can purchase as well. But other than that, if you have any questions or comments, make sure to post them below. And if you like this video, make sure to like and subscribe to the Out Jeeping YouTube channel. Until next time, I'll see you guys in the next video.